So you heard about what LONGSCAN has to offer in terms of kind of the conceptualization of LONGSCAN, the measures and what we have, and how we tried to do what we do. And now I'd like to try to talk to you as best that I can about how to take what we have available and help you apply that to what your own interests are. And the answer to all of it is generally that's about what we have, and it all depends, and thank you for your attention. Any questions? Okay, that's it. Well, okay. So I tried to organize this as best I could in the way that makes sense to me, but I'll have to preface this by saying that I have been working with LONGSCAN for 7 years, so I have sort of a unique understanding of the data that, as I'm going through this, might not make any sense to anybody else. I'm hoping in the end that it will kind of all come together for you. And some of it may seem a little mind-numbing, and I'll try to go through that part of it as much as I can, but I feel like that the more you know about it, both in terms of the really sort of technical parts about how the data sets are named, to where you can find variables that almost all of you will need, to the end part, which is talking about attrition in the sample, that hopefully it will help you to sort of navigate more smoothly all of the data sets that we have. Now, I don't know off the top of my head how many data sets that there actually are here over the time frames that we've deposited, but I know that where I sit, we're sitting on over 400 of them at this point. So that's a lot to keep up with. So the more that you kind of know in terms of the general structure and the way that things work and the evolution of kind of where we got to now, I hope that it will help make things a little bit easier for you. So I've kind of organized it into, some of it will be a little bit of a repeat in terms of when we collected, how we collected, who from, the data structure in terms of how data sets are named, scored data, recommendations for construction of data sets, linking observations and data sets, documentation, the maltreatment data, data sets that have useful variables, talk about a couple of data sets or ways to think about some of the data that are sort of more specific to some of the interests that you have from reading some of the interests from your sheets. And then some of the data nuances, which is always just a treat. Attrition. So you just get started. Please interrupt me at any point if I'm not entirely clear, and I will not be entirely clear. Again, it's one of those things where you have it in your head, and getting it out to somebody else is not always that easy. I tend not to see the forest for the trees. So if you need me to back up and take a larger view, I'll try to do that as best I can. So some of this early part is going to be just a repeat of what you've heard already. But I want to kind of talk about it in that this is going to be important to reference because the data are structured around these things. So our face-to-face interviews were conducted at 4, 6, 8, and 12, our annual contacts in the off years. And then our interviews are conducted separately with the participants and their caregivers. And I'm just saying that, again, because the data are going to be structured in part by visit, by who the respondent was, and kind of around the evolution of the data collection methods when the type of data management system in use at the time. As was alluded to, the data management systems changed over time to keep up with the technology in use at the time of the field. So we started in 1991 and currently, so we've had 3 evolutions of a data management system, where the early one, the data were collected on paper and pencil, interviewer administered, and then entered by hand into the DMS. That would cover up through age 7, or annual contacts through age 7. At age 8, it was interview administered but computer assisted. So I think they did it with the computer and kind of entered it as the interview was being conducted, but it was still interview administered. And that was 8 to 11 was administered in that data management system. Then at age 12 marked the beginning of the audio-enabled computer assisted self-interview format. And that data management system goes from 12 to 18. And I'll tell you, at 12, that sort of changed everything in terms of of data from what I have to work with. We'll get to that shortly. In terms of informants, we have the child informant, where data were collected at each face-to-face interview. At age 12, the time and the amount of data collected from the child participant was astronomically different than any other interview prior to that. It was a lot more data that were collected directly from the participant. Those interviews also got a lot more complicated, particularly as administered to the child. So a lot of those questionnaires and measures were branching administrations. That's also going to be important in terms of knowing the data and what the data look like. Caregiver informants, the data were collected at all the face-to-face interviews and the annual contact interviews. CPS, those review cycles vary, so the data collection is not necessarily correspond to the face-to-face interviews. The reviews were done differently at the different sites. Generally, no more than 2 years would pass without a comprehensive review of the participants, but sometimes those review cycles varied depending on access to CPS agencies at that time. We also collected data from the teachers, and there are some, interview is kind of not technically an informant, but they do provide interview ratings, and they also did, for particularly in the early part, and then I think for the Vineland at 12, administer some developmental and cognitive and social measures to the participants, to the youth participants. We have combination of different structures of data sets. Some of our data sets are flat, indicating there's only one observation per ID. Some people refer to those as being wide data sets. Then there are stacked data sets where there are multiple observations per ID. Some refer to those as long data sets. Regardless of who the informant is, all the data are linked by the child subject identification number, which is a combination of the study site and then a unique numeric identifier. Okay, and most of the stuff you're going to see general in white because it's all general. A lot of exceptions. So general rule of thumb is that there is a data set for each measure, for each respondent, for each visit. But there are some exceptions. So for our stacked data sets, or the one where there are multiple observations per ID, there could be multiple observations because they were administered at multiple visits, like the CBCL. They are multiple referrals, like the CPS data. Or, for example, at age 12, there are multiple respondents of the same type. So we may have had more than one teacher responding about the same child at the same visit. That's why there would be multiple observations per ID in some of our bigger, longer, stacked data sets. But regardless, again, particularly with the latter, with regard to teachers, or if it was the caregiver interview, or the child interview, or the annual contact interviews, all of the IDs are the child subject identification number. They're all linked that way. All the data sets can be merged by ID. Data set naming. So how many of you have gotten into looking at the data in the data sets? So you notice the data set names are a little funky? Let's see if I can tell you how we got there. So generally, again, data set names could be broken down into the abbreviation of the measure name, and in some cases it might be the construct name. It just sort of depends. I take no credit or responsibility for naming them. I didn't do it. The form version and the data closure date. For us, it's the data retrieval date, but for here, it's the data closure date because the data we deposit here are closed out. There's no more data collection for that particular interview. For example, the DEMA 0404 is going to be the demographics form version A, and the data closure date was April of 2004. Most of the data sets are 8 characters long, except data from the 8 to 11 data management system, for whatever reason, in that particular DMS system we were working with, I think it was one of the earlier versions of FoxPro, wouldn't allow an 8-character name. So The form name is going to be actually a 3-character name with the 4 numeric closure date on the end. So you can see the DEA 0708, and you see it has a different closure date there because it was closed out after the age 4 date. And then there's a couple of exceptions too, particularly at age 12, and there's a couple at age 4, where there might have been 2 different form versions, but they were really close enough that it doesn't make sense to maintain the 2 different versions. So you guys don't have 400 data sets that you have to live with. We tried to combine them to make it a little bit easier for you so that you don't have so much to stack and then merge and transpose and do all the acrobatics that you need to do. And so in those cases, what we would try to do is drop the form name at the end, and those will be a sort of a 3-digit character prior to the closure date. In some cases, we have measures that are really the same thing, but they were administered at different time points that were in different data management systems. So, for example, the CESD, the depression scale, was administered at 4 and 6 and then again at 12. But there's 2 different data sets for that because the data management system changed. So there'll be the DEPA and the DEPB because the difference is the data management system in use at the time. That's not always the case, just generally. For example, the CBCL is collected at all of the time points. It covers all of the data management systems, but we've combined that for you. Same with the teacher form. Data set names may change, or form versions may change if we did any variations between form versions to the wording, the response options, the order of the questions. Any changes to a previous version gets a new form name and a new data set. That's how we got to 400 of the little buggers. And so, for example, the demographics forms are here. So we have the DEMA at 4, the DE6A at 6, the DEA at 8, and the DEMB at 12. All of those are caregiver demographics form. They generally ask the same thing, the same questions. But there are some slight differences either to response options. For example, income on the DEMA, maybe the DE6A, I don't think there's a category 12, which is unknown. But in the DEMB, there is, so it's a different form name. And then you have to remember the code that is missing, because 12 doesn't mean anything. You have to watch out for that stuff. The variable names are going to be a reflection of the form name. So the DEMA, those variables will be DEMA1, DEMA2, DEMA3. The DE6A will be DE6A1, 2, 3, and they're not going to be in the same order if the question order changed over the form versions. So, data dictionary, be your best friend. If this is going to be a bad example, so it's like a sort of kind of example. So I'll tell you what I mean, because I looked at it later. I'm like, okay, that just didn't make sense. So if the construct is the same construct like depression is assessed over time, but we change the measure, like the CESD at 4 and 6 to the BSI at 8, then back to the CESD at 12. Generally, the mnemonic or the data set name is going to represent the measure name, not the construct, and then I'm going to follow up with an example that doesn't really show that. But so at the CESD at 4 and 6, the data set name is the DEPA, and then at 8 we changed it to the BSI, so that's the BSA, and then back to the DEPB at 12. The part where it doesn't make sense is why the age 4 and 6 is DEPA and not CESA, but so it's kind of sort of example, but so anyway. Okay, if we have scored a measure, like the CBCL or the Vineland or the WIPSI, those, well, not the WIPSI, those scores are going to be housed in a different data set. So they're not included with the item level data. There's a different data set. There's a different data dictionary for all of those scored data. And what they're going to have is generally those scored data will have a partial mnemonic of the item level data set, but they'll end with an S, generally. generally. So, for example, the CBCL is in the CBCL data set, and the scored data for the CBCL is going to be in the CBCS data set. In terms of constructing analysis data sets, because there are some that are stacked and some that are flat, and particularly when we get to the RNA-B, you don't want to try to merge them all together and make a LONGSCAN data set. Don't do it. It's bad, 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 bad idea. Don't try to do that. What instead you need to do is kind of think about what your analysis questions are, look at the measures manual, the data dictionaries, find out what variables you need from what data sets, look at the structure of those data sets and figure out if they're not in the same format, how to get them in the same format, and then do your merge at that point and make your life a lot easier than trying to figure out how to transpose all of this and make you one big, really monster, nasty data set. Alternatively, if you want to do a longitudinal analysis, for example, HLM or some of the GE models where you need a stacked data set, then you need to, again, look at the structure and kind of get that in all the data sets in the right structure so you can do a merge. In that case, you would do it by ID and visit to get it in the right structure that you have this nice stacked data set. And if you have any questions about how to do that, Holly will help you out. So how to link the data sets and observations. Again, all the data sets can be linked by ID. That's the one thing across all the data sets where you can merge them together is by ID. If you want to do a stacked data set and pull them together that way, then you need to link by ID and then visit number. The visit number essentially is the interview number, corresponds to the age. I might use visit and age sort of interchangeably, but it means the same thing. So visit will be 4, 6, 8, and 12. Any questions so far? Super. Okay, so critical information. I can't tell you how important it is to reference these pieces of information. The measures manuals and the data dictionaries. And you need both of them, trust me. You need them both because they each contain unique sources and pieces of information that you need to use in conjunction with each other. The measures manuals, there are 3 volumes, and that's the reference website. I think they're also available some way through you guys. And then the data dictionaries. The data dictionaries are on our website, but they're on our internal site. You can access them through there, but we've sent them here, and I think that last document was just for 12 was 400 and something odd pages long, just for 12. But you need it, trust me, you need it. So let me talk about the structure and what's in these things and why they're really so important and critical. So for the measures manual, again, I said we have 3 volumes. They correspond to the developmental periods that we've had over the study. So the early one covers up to 4, the middle childhood covers up to 12, and then the early adolescent is 12 and 14, but yeah, 12 and 14 because you'll link out to what we have. Within these, what's described, there's an overall description of the measure, whether we developed it or whether it was one that we borrowed or modified or one that was a standardized measure out there like the CBCL, will be the purpose, the conceptual organization, the item selection, materials, administration, method, and training. That's just generally for whatever measure that was. Scoring types and score interpretations. What I also want to say about this is that there might be some things in the measures manual about scoring where we did not score it. So it might be some hints about ways that the author, for example, has suggested you might use the data that we did not formally score or include. Good to look there. Norms of comparative data. Then the LONGSCAN use. When we administered it to the mnemonic inversion, so the data set names. If there's a scored data set, it will tell you what that data set is, makes it easier for you to reference back to what you're trying to look for, because sometimes the measure name and the data set name don't necessarily correspond very well. The rationale for the administration and any administration or scoring notes, also very important here, because if there are any site deviations, any differences in the way that that particular measure was done, that's going to be there. It will describe any differences in site deviations in administration. For example, it will tell you that the VICA, the caregiver victimization, was not administered at the Southwest site. It will tell you that the CTS, parent to child, at visit 4, not administered at Southwest site, and at the Northwest site, the response options were different than the other sites. So always very important to look at any deviations in site administration. Then we provide descriptive statistics and any reliability and validity that we did with our sample. So it's our descriptive statistics of our sample, how they performed on the measure. And then references and the bibliography. Okay, so for the data dictionaries, there's detailed information on every single variable and every single data set that we have. And the scored data, when we scored the data for any measure, it exists in its own data set. It has its own data dictionary. And we include the algorithms for how that was scored and any interpretation on sort of how to interpret the scores or any other general information that you would need to know regarding the scored data, if there is any that you would need to know, other than if it was obvious. The data dictionaries that you will have, I think, are arranged in the following order. So there'll be a table of contents, then there's item level data, then there's scored data. So always remember your scored data is going to be at the bottom. And then there are appendices that would be relevant to these data. For example, I think we sent the code book for the CPS data, and then I think we also included a tutorial on how to use the CPS data, the RNA-B data set, I think is what it's called. So there'll be some additional information in those appendices for your use. This is what one looks like. So I'm going to point out some important information that you can find, some little ways that you can figure out what's in where. So they'll always be, they're all arranged in exactly the same way, where you have the variable name, format, description, and the coding categories for all of them. They're all set up this way. The center variable, that's going to tell you who has data for that particular measure. So again, not all of the sites administered all of the measures at all the time points. So if you look at that, it's going to tell you who has data there. And for those where we have stack data, or we have multiple observations per kid, this will tell you what sites administered at what time points. So you can see if there's any deviations, or if one site, for example, doesn't have a 6, and the others have 4 and 8 and 12 or something like that. So if you look here, it's going to tell you who has it and when. And then these would be, so for example, for each item, you'll get the description of what the item was, and then the coding categories, so what all the response options are, because I don't think that we have value labels for all the response options. So you can't just do like a proc contents and figure it out. You kind of need to supplement that. And then what I've highlighted here is this is one of our age 12 measures, the delinquency survey. This is just, I just took a part of it. So we go through, and the kid, again, at age 12 in particular, what the kid sees is that they see basically one question come up at a time. You know, did you take part in a gang? And then they answer that. And then the next question comes up. Did you belong to a group others might consider a gang? And then they answer that. And then when they get, like, to this one, were you in a physical fight? If they answer no, then it goes to item 5. If they answer yes, then they get how many times were you in a physical fight? So if you, for example, were interested in using as a variable the number of times the kid was in a physical fight, then you have to understand that the DMS skips anybody who said no, and you're going to have missing data on that variable for everybody who said no. So you're going to have to go in and do a little bit of recoding so you don't lose those subjects out. And go back in and know you're going to have to say, okay, well, if ASDA 4 is 0, then ASDA 4A is going to have to be equal to 0, sort of change your quasi-continuous scale a little bit and add another coding option so you don't lose half your sample and then be putting all your data sets together like, why did I lose 500 kids? I don't get it. So the measures manual there's a link in the measures manual right to the form. So you can see on the form where the skips are, and then use this to supplement, and then when you're going through it, kind of will guide you on it, and if you need to do some recoding or actual sort of programming in terms of putting your data sets together. So this is a wonderful multi-informant, multi-method study. Yay, LONGSCAN. And we have lots of different maltreatment data types. The CPS case record reviews, the very raw data that describes the actual coding and entry of the CPS records is in the RNAB data set. Then we have constructed a data set that kind of aggregates a lot of data out of that CPS data to make it a lot easier to work with. That turns that case record review data set into a flat data file, sort of aggregates over all the data. So that's a derived set of data that we've done for you. Then, as Al mentioned earlier, there's some caregiver reported sexual abuse. There's the SB8 and the SAC. Al referred to them by measure name. I refer to them by data set name. In these data sets, there's also the U-Self report that we collect at 12. The parentheses, that refers to the scored data set. So that's where you'll find the scores for those measures. We did not send the scores for the About My Parents, or the, technically that's the multi-dimensional neglectful scale for parenting, I think is the technical name, the Strauss modification of the Strauss et al. Measure, because we're still sort of trying to figure out what we're doing with those scores. And then if there was a positive endorsement on the sexual abuse scale, then they also got some supplemental questions on the SASA, but that's not necessarily scored. So those are where you can get some of the maltreatment data from different informants. Then if you were feeling really spunky, you could look at other possible data places to get it from, like the conflict tactics scale. And then other possible places would be the conflict tactics scale parent to child. The 4 is asterisk because, again, the San Diego site did administer that at 4, and the response options at the Seattle site were slightly different than the other response options. There were some IRB concerns at their site, so they could ask whether it happened or not, but not the frequency with which it happened. So there'd be some variations by site. All explained in the measures manual. Let's talk about the case record reviews. So Al talked a little bit about this. I'm going to talk about a little bit more, just in case you didn't get enough. So the case record reviews are reviewed for each subject depending on when the site could get in and review. It's supposed to be lifetime reviews at each cycle that they review it to make sure that they didn't miss any, that they didn't happen again in the previous review. Really, there is a tri-coding of allegations and findings, to where we also code the CPS label for maltreatment allegations, findings, and risk factors. Then we code them using the NIS system, and then we code them using the MMCS system for allegations and findings. For this, we use CPS labels, and for the latter two, we use the allegation narrative and the summary findings. And the summary findings and substantiations are only going to be available if the case was accepted for investigation. At least that's the way it's supposed to look. Each type of coding offers a different perspective and slightly different information. So it's always good to read what it is, what's available, and what your question would be best suited in terms of the data applicable. So the observations in this data set, the RNAB, any given observation reflects a referral, a new referral to CPS. Any referral can have up to 6 allegations and 6 substantiations for any referral. The number of observations or referrals are going to vary across the participants depending on how many referrals that there were, and the number of allegations for any given referral are going to vary depending on what was alleged when the referent called in. The data in this data set are not organized by age of the participant or interview cycle. There's nothing in there that you're going to be able to use to merge in. You're going to have to use a combination of the date of the referral and the subject's date of birth to figure out when it happened, and it takes a little work. If you want any tips, you can ask Chris.
They're not by ID number, child ID?
Yeah, it's by ID.
Oh, okay.
But you don't want to merge it that way, trust me. I mean, because you're going to get, I mean, I'll show you in a minute why you don't want to do that. You don't want to do that. So, but the visit number in the RNAB kind of reflects when the review done that was closest to the visit number and the form sequence, so how many referrals were coded during that review cycle. So it's going to be like a visit 220. 220 doesn't, you can't merge in by that visit. It doesn't fit with any of the other visit numbers for the face-to-face interviews. It doesn't help you. And it doesn't line up with anything. So you can merge by ID, you're going to have to work with the data before you can merge it at all. So the great news is that these data are structured to provide the absolute most flexible use of this data. You can get anything you want. You can structure it any way you want. You can figure out what time frames you want out of it. Super, super flexible. But you may have to spend a considerable amount of work trying to massage that data set to get it to work the way that you might want it to. It takes a little programming skill to do that. As such, there's a tutorial provided for you on how to use those data if you are so brave to want to do that. And you might need to do that. For example, Megan wanted to know the severity of the first incidence of physical neglect reported for the kids in the sample. Well, you have to go to this data set to get that out. So this is an example, a very small piece of what the structure of this data set looks like. So for this one, so this little guy has one observation here. There's only one referral of maltreatment for this little guy. And I just took a little pieces of what we might have. So it looks like this guy has 2 allegations in his narrative. We get the maltreatment code, the severity. We have up to 2 perpetrators coded for any allegation, along with their gender and age. And then we go into the second piece of information on out to 6. We also get who the referent was, so who called in the allegation, whether the case was investigated, again, the CPS labels, including risk factors and what they labeled the maltreatment, and then everything is repeated for substantiation. So all of the allegations are repeated, and then there's a conclusion code for whether or not it was substantiated, new severity, perpetrators, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This guy had 2 reviews, and during this one there were 2 referrals. In this referral, he had 1 allegation. In this referral, there were 2 allegations. In this review, only 1. This guy had 2 allegations for this particular review. So what I'm pointing out here is that the number of observations per ID is going to vary depending on what was found in the review cycles for these individuals over basically from birth through 12. And this data set currently houses 4,000 observations, covers 914 kids. The number of reports per individual, 214 subjects have 1 report. Let's see, 19 subjects have 10 reports, or referrals, I should say. And then there are 2 subjects who have 20 reports. Now you notice this is 914 kids. So if there's no allegation, if there's no report, there's no observation for that kid in this data set. So if you try to merge in, you're going to have missing data for the other whatever number that is from 1354. Okay. So if there's no report, there's no observation in this data set. Now I will say we have looked and used number of allegations versus yes, no, there was an allegation, and really the data are pretty skewed and almost kind of come out bimodal anyway. So you can see it's pretty heavy on the less than sort of 5 end, and then dramatically goes down from there. Usually we found if we've modeled something with number of allegations and then we've modeled them with it's a yes or no, there's no difference in the outcome or associations. But again, it would depend on your research question. But this, if you try, so if we have 1354, and you were merging in this data set with 4,000, this is why you just wouldn't want to do that. Okay, so just in case you don't want to deal with that, we've developed some ways to sort of help you work with this a little bit better. And that is the N_SD dataset, or we'll call it the MSD dataset. Basically, what we've done is tried to make this a little bit easier for you to work with, so you don't have to try to get these and do a bunch of arrays and transpose it and then merge it in. We've tried to do all of that for you to get it down to one observation per ID. We've aggregated a lot of the information, and we've added, in addition to that, a lot of the variables that were used in the dimensions papers from the 2005 Child Abuse and Neglect special issue as well, in terms of maximum severity, expanded hierarchical type, single versus multiple, chronicity as well. So these are relevant to the data that were collected. We've just aggregated them for you, and we've done it into time frames that correspond to our face-to-face interviews. The information contained in the MLTX, which was deposited with the last deposit of the 8 to 11, and the MSD, the variables included are all the same. The kinds of information are the same, but the time frames are different. So in the MLTX, the time frames were based on the chronological age of the child. The MSD is based on the date of the interview, so the date that the child had an interview. If the child or caregiver did not have an interview at that date, at that time frame, then we use the chronological age to substitute in when that time frame would be. So it's easier for us when we archive it here, because in part the interviews do not always occur at or around the child's birthday for that particular interview period. So you don't want to use a chronological age if the interview happened prior to that, and be using information that occurred after the fact. So we thought it was really easier and made more sense to make these timeframes correspond to the interview. And again, that's Al's request. It's from the San Diego site. You can thank Al for making your analyses cleaner. So included in this data set are allegations, referrals, the CPS determinants and referrals based on the summary, the referral narrative, and we have number of allegations, number of reports, indicators. So if you don't want to use numbers, you can have the yes/no indicators. We have indicators and numbers for type of maltreatment: physical, sexual, emotional abuse, neglect, broken down into failure to provide, lack of supervision. We have the educational neglect, moral, illegal, drugs, alcohol. We have whether there was a single type of abuse referred or multiple types of abuse referred within that particular time frame. Combinations of maltreatment types, so the expanded hierarchical variable, which says, okay, it was sexual abuse alone or physical abuse alone, or it was physical and sexual abuse, or it was neglect and other types together. We have the maximum severity for each type of abuse. And this chronicity variable, actually, you should know it only goes to 9.5. So if it doesn't go all the way to 12, it goes to 9.5. And all of these are broken down into time frames from 0 to 4, 4 to 6, 6 to 8, 8 to 10, 10 to 12, and 8 to 12. Makes it very easy to aggregate over time frames if you're interested in, say, 0 to 6 and 6 to 12, or some combination of those. If you want to go backwards and you want to do 0 to 2, then you need to get friendly with the RNA-B data set, because we don't have that right now. Maybe in your next installment, but not currently. Now, just an example of this structure. See, it's nice and clean. There's one observation per kid. That works. And so for this one, it's like the number of physical abuse allegations from 0 to 4. This one is a 2. Substantiations is a 0. Maximum severity on across. And then this would be like 4 to 6 is 0. So you have that for each subject all the way across the time frames available. And in this one, there are 1,354 subjects. So it's all the subjects, not just the ones with the report. And if they didn't have a report, then they'll have zeros filled in for you. So you don't have to fill in your missing data. It's all there, 1,354. Okay, so that's what I just said. This represents aggregated data, but specific, you won't have data specific to any particular referral or allegation. And And or if you're interested in a time frame that we don't have divvied up already, then you'll have to go back to the other one to work with that. Okay, so notes of caution about either of these two data sets. The absence of an observation in the RNA-B does not necessarily mean that there was no maltreatment of that subject. You have to remember that these are CPS data we're working with. The problems with using data from these social service agencies, there are problems inherent in doing that. In some cases, if we waited too long to review and the case wasn't accepted for investigation, they could have expunged the records, not there to review, but in fact there was a referral. Maybe it wasn't in the records at the time of review. So it doesn't necessarily mean there wasn't any maltreatment, but we work with what we have to work with. But in the aggregated data, in the MSD, we assume that no maltreatment or no referral, no record in the RNA-B assumes that it's no maltreatment. I mean, that's to some extent the best that we could do. Okay, so let me talk to you a little bit about, thank you.
Are there data sets with not useful variables?
Yes. I'm sure there are. But these are sort of data sets where you almost are always going to have to pull something out of in terms of reporting your sample or control variables, things like that. So these are places where you can find the data that you're almost always going to end up using. The IDS, the IDS file is what we refer to as our master file. So you could get child gender and child race from other forms at different times. I wouldn't recommend it. This is our master file, this IDS file. It's invariant, it's not going to change. It's data we collected at baseline. Because I tell you, we've got kids that change race throughout the study. I'm not kidding. There might be one or two that change gender. I'm also not kidding. Because again, depending on the age of the interview, this is data that, you know, the caregivers or the youth are entering in themselves. So we do checks to the best extent that we can on these, but the master file right here. So child gender, child race, child date of birth. We have interview indicators. This is to help you with your, if you need to do any kind of subsampling. Say, okay, well, I know my outcome is at 8, so if they don't have an age 8 interview, it makes it a lot easier to subsample my data by dropping anybody who doesn't have where CH underscore age 8 equals 1. So there are interview indicators in there that tell you whether the youth or the child had completed an interview by our standards, which are pretty lax. That doesn't mean if they completed one, if they have a 1 there, that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be missing data for whatever you're interested in. So a completed interview doesn't mean there are no missing data. This is like to depending on the interview, up to 2.5 hours worth of measures for each respondent. Sometimes they skip things. And then study site. I've asterisked date of birth here because if for any of you that have already been in the data, you know that we try our best to de-identify participant information as much as we can. Any dates, referral dates from CPS, interview dates, child's dates of birth, all of the dates are de-identified to be the 15th of the month, whatever it is. So if you got in the data and said, wow, look at that, all their birth dates are all on the 15th. Cool, how did they select that sample? But that's the way it is. So it's not going to, it's not going to make any difference because it's just going to be plus or minus, less than 15 days. But I did want to just sort of point that out, that it is de-identified to the 15th of the month. Okay, other data sets, the cover sheets. There's a cover sheet completed for each interview for each informant other than teachers. And that will have, for the caregiver, it will have what their relationship is to the child, and we'll have date of the interview. So for the child, these are the cover sheets. The 4 is asterisked here because the Eastern site did not complete cover sheets on their kids. I don't know why. These are the caregiver cover sheets, and then these are the annual contact cover sheets. So those are there. Another that we sort of deposited very last minute was the derived household composition data set. And again, what we tried to do is that 4, 6, 8, and 12, we gave different measures to try to figure out who was in the household and who was living with the child. The way that data were collected and the response options and the way you could code who that person was kind of changed from form to form. And if you were looking over time, it was a little difficult to try to merge in all of these forms, and the coding options changed. And one, it might have only gone from 1 to 8, and then the next variation went from 1 to 15, and so it could get a little hairy in terms of kind of getting all this collected into one. So we aggregated all of this again in the derived household composition form. What you can get out of this is the respondent's gender and relationship to the child at each time point. Annual contact interviews are not included in this. The foster status of the caregiver, number of adults, children in total in the household, indicators for the presence of particular household members, whether it's a multi-generational household, and then there are 3 here that are attempting to kind of get at the general structure of the household in terms of family structure, household composition, and then living arrangement. All this in the data dictionary. So a couple of data sets that I kind of wanted, or ways to conceptualize some data that I thought some of you were particularly interested in, including the caregiver arrangement or the foster issue, and another was the history of victimization. I'm going to go quickly through this because Al covered a lot of this. Ways to kind of figure this out, or options to sort of figure this out. First of all of the participants from the Northwestern site were removed from their homes prior to age 4. There you go. Southwest site, sorry, Southwest. I know, it's from the San Diego site. There's one. The caregiver relationship to the youth at the time of the interview, those are in the derived household composition forms. The cover sheets at the face-to-face and the annual contact interviews will indicate on there if that's a foster caregiver. The household composition forms, and as well as the life event scale for children. I'll get to that in a minute. So you need to look at the data dictionaries again very carefully, because from 4 to 6, in the cover sheets, the distinction between kin and non-kin foster was not made. And then after that, it was made, so it doesn't exactly line up between 4 and 6 and then after, that post-time points. And if you want to look at the life events life event scale, and again, the advantage of that is it was collected every year, so you do have the advantage of looking in between the face-to-face interviews. And there is a question that asked in the last year, has the child moved away from the family? And if the answer is yes, then there's some questions about the number of times that they've moved for various reasons, and one of those would be moved into, the number of times moved into foster care or group home or shelter. These data sets are the LECA, which is at 5, 6, and 7, and I asterisk 5 because the Baltimore site did not administer that at 5. The LEB is the 8 to 11 data, and then the LECC is at 12. And I should note that the LECC version asks whether or not they moved to foster care, doesn't say how many times. There's a slight version in the response option there. I'm trying to move a little bit faster. This is what I promised in terms of who the caregiver was across time. In most cases, it's the bio mom, but you'll see that there are different caregivers represented, and the percentages of who those caregivers were do change to some degree over time. Foster mother is again asterisk because depending on the time administration, the characterization of a foster caregiver is different depending on the cover sheet. Okay, just quickly, the caregiver victimization and loss was actually split into 2 separate measures. One's assessing loss, one assessing history of victimization. The VICA, the victimization part, was not administered by the San Diego site. Okay, data considerations. The first sort of funky thing is that LONGSCAN considers as its baseline sample any interview or any participant who had a 4 or 6. As Des alluded to, when you look at the number of interviews completed for each time frame, we don't have 1354 at 4. And the reason why is there are 104 participants who don't have a 4 but who have a 6. Site samples vary by maltreatment risk and entrance into the study. That means that the age of our kids are going to vary depending on what site they were from. And the age distribution within a site. So one site, the kids were all about the same age, but for all the other sites, there's a continuum of ages within the site, so that there could be more than one interviewer being conducted at any one time, not with the same participants, of course, but there are age ranges of their samples. They could have younger kids and older kids, but there's one site that only had kids of one age, so only one interview was being administered there. Why is this important? Well, because if you look at things like poverty or welfare reform or service receipt, you might want to keep in mind, and you're going to say, look, at age 4, that when we started, the first interview for age 4 was conducted in 91, and by the time we finished, it was 2000. So you might want to consider the cohort situation if you're looking at something like social services or welfare or poverty or something along those lines. They're not age 4. It doesn't mean age 4 at one time for all folks. It was quite a range in the administration of those. Also, in terms of the age range, this is why kind of looking at the interview is important, or the date of the interview, and not assuming that an age 12 means that they were 12 at the time that that interview was administered, is when you look at the mean, they fall in about the places they're just supposed to, but if you look at the minimum and maximum, we've got kids that were 7 and they got the age 4 interview, and that can depend on when the interview went into the field and how old the oldest participant was at the oldest site, and it's important to get data. We got data. Okay, attrition. Okay, so the types of attrition. Attrition in LONGSCAN is very hard to talk about because our sample, it's not like they fall out and then never return. That is the case for some kids, but in some cases they miss an interview but return for other interviews. In some cases they miss a lot of interviews and return for another interview. The number of interviews may vary. We can have a child interview completed but not the caregiver, or the caregiver and not the child. It's pretty complex to talk about, really, and the study hasn't ended. So it's very hard for me to kind of tell you what the attrition rate is in LONGSCAN. So I don't know what the attrition rate is yet. And we've got kids coming back at 18, and I don't know how many there are, but I know that there are some kids coming back who we haven't seen since age 6. So it happens. So there are overall 3 types of attrition: those that were approached but didn't consent, the consented but they didn't participate, and then there were participated but they didn't complete. For LONGSCAN, in particular, we have very limited data and not cross-site. So it's not in any database where you can talk about who was approached but didn't consent. For consented but didn't participate, we have those who consented, who participated in the baseline only, where we have no data up to 12. I can't say that then there won't be data at any time point, but I refer to them as suspected drops at this point. And then there were participated but didn't complete. And in these cases, the number of completed interviews are going to vary across individuals, and the sequence of responses are going to vary across individuals. So the pattern of completion is going to vary. Reasons for attrition is not any different than any other longitudinal study, is death, participant withdrawal, and then lack of contact. And participant withdrawal is even a little fuzzy because at 18 they can consent for themselves, and some do come back into the study that their participation was previously withdrawn for them on behalf of the caregivers. So at 18 they can consent for themselves, and they do come back in and decide to participate. And then lack of contact, and those would be where the study has attempted to follow them, attempted to recontact them, and they've lost touch, and some period has occurred where they just haven't been able to follow them. And a lot of new and interesting things have been occurring in attempts to relocate these people, including Facebook and MySpace and other efforts to try to track down these missing participants. So some of them we're finding contact with as the ways to find people evolve. Just briefly, there are types of missing data, one in which the participant didn't complete the interview, or where there was an interview done but didn't complete all of the responses or all of the measures within an interview. So there's item non-response where they didn't complete items within a measure, or the unit non-response, which is when they didn't complete a measure at all. Then there are some issues that you need to be concerned about for either one of those in terms of the randomness of who did or didn't participate or what data were or were not missing. Our starting baseline sample, sort of kind of technically, it's really 2,708 because we collect data from interview caregivers and from our child participants or about or on our child participants. Our child participants stay the same. That's 1354 of the same kids, but our caregiver participants may vary over time. So as long as we have a caregiver interview, doesn't matter who it was, even if it changed over time, we don't consider that caregiver as attrited out of the study for a new caregiver to replace them. So we're really only counting the 1354 here. But the way LONGSCAN counts their interviews is if there is a caregiver or a child interview. However, in the LONGSCAN master file, the IDS file, you can look at those separately. They're indicators for the youth and for the caregiver. But we count them, our interview counts are based on having either or. Okay, so in terms of, so if you want to look at attrition in terms of, okay, well, I'll count it by the number of interviews completed. Well, one problem is that we have 104 who were added or who have a 6 but not a 4. So you can't look at number of interviews and say, well, they should have had a 4, 6, 8, 12, 4 interviews. So anybody with less than a 4 is a dropout. That won't work. And also, they may still be active even if they have not completed the full sequence of interviews. So we start with the baseline sample, and you can conceptualize it as either they completed it or they didn't complete it, but you probably won't use your data that way. So you probably are not going to start out and say, okay, if they didn't complete all 4 interviews, or their baseline plus 8 and 12, I'm going to drop them, period. Because they could have completed the interview you're interested in. So you don't want to drop them out that way. So it really doesn't make sense to conceptualize them as they either completed it all or they didn't. So there's alternate ways in terms of there's completers, and then there's drops, those who don't have anything past the baseline, and then there's partial completers. And those partial completers may have been partial sequential completers or partial non-sequential completers. And you know, does it really matter whether they're sequential completers or partial non-sequential completers? Probably not, so we put them in a partial completer group, completers, and then suspected drops where there's no post-baseline data. So here's looking at our completion rates over time. So at age 4, looking at the 1250 to the 1354, 92%, 91%, 84%, 72%. So these are all relating back to the 1354 sample. If you look at the number of interviews completed, again, knowing that there's the problem of the 104 that have a 6 but not a 4, the mean is about 3.4, and 60% of the sample completed all 4, with 26, 9, and 5 completing the fewer of the interviews. I'm going really fast, so just stop me if you have any questions, but all this is in the handout. Now, looking at the retention rate between interviews, so this is between 4 and 5. So for all those who had a 4 who also had a 6, there's 84%. All those who had a 6 and an 8, 81%. And then from 8 to 12 is 67%. So what's interesting is if you look at between 8 and 12, there's a 67% retention rate. But if you look at 12 to baseline, it's 72. So that just, again, shows the subjects move in and out of the study. So looking at the percentage of completers, partial completers, and baseline, 65% are considered completers. They have a baseline plus an 8 and a 12. Partial completers, 30%, and then only 5% are suspected drops right now at 12 for what you have. So suspected drops have only completed 1. Partial completers have completed more than 1 but fewer than 4, and then completers have completed all of them. And then what I've done here is I've looked at 3 columns. The columns sum to 100 for any given demographic or attribute in terms of completers, partial completers, and suspected drops for males, females, our racial distribution. And there are very few differences. I didn't go to the extent of analyzing these or showing you differences because it really is going to depend on your specific analysis question and what your analysis sample ends up being. So it really doesn't make sense for me to kind of go through the exercise of that. But I can tell you that to some degree there's a site difference, and to a small degree there's an ethnic difference. That I think we lose our white kids some of our white kids. And then here's the different status at recruitment, maltreatment, and site. Very few differences. So for the most part, our sample characteristics over time stay pretty close to the same. Okay, and just to show you some of the craziness in terms of our partial completers. So these are just the partial completers, so those who didn't complete all of them. So these are the kind of a list of crosstabs. So this top, 49% completed 4, 6, and 8, but no 12. And then these completed a 4 and a 6, but don't have 8 or 12. These completed a 4 and a 6, and then a 12, but missed the 8. And you can see the pattern down between. This one has a 4, and this one has a 12, but nothing in between, and just 3% of those. So just an interesting pattern of completion among the subjects. Okay, then in terms of dealing with missing data, there are all sorts of different options available to you. Here's what they are, and some references if you're interested in learning more about dealing with missing data. The end. Any questions? Sorry to go so long. Is there any questions after that? Holly will answer them for you.